all this information is truly designed to help you be more healthful. So upgrade your health, if you will. So detoxification, a very, very hot topic, something that is in our marketplace in a lot of different shapes and forms. Some of them can hold a lot of expenses and a lot of supplements and a lot of details and a lot of restrictions, and they can be very short, 7 to 10 days. They can be very fast, or I should say long, anywhere up to a month. And now there are bodies of evidence and papers out there that are demonstrating some more specific ways to detox. So I'm here to uncover a methodology that we're using, very contemporary methodology, that is easy to follow. But the unfortunate thing that I can't do today is I can't give you specifics. I can give you generalizations, but I can't give you specifics. Why? Because we are individualized and customized in our healthcare delivery form. So what will work for one person because of their chemistry is not going to work for somebody else. So you'll see that as we uncover where we're going. So let's get into it. Detoxification. And ask questions if you want, so the information is clear. Detoxification. Are we toxic? The simplest answer is yes, we are. We're toxic. We are exposed to toxins on a daily basis. And if you've seen some of my stuff and my information, my posts from before, what's the thing that contributes to our aging or our health problems more so than anything else? Our lifestyle and our environment. So we are exposed to toxins on a daily basis, and not just one type of toxin, but a vast amount of toxins. And so what we're going to do is we're going to the second question here is, how do toxins affect us? First and foremost, we can talk about the neuroendocrine system, our hormones, our thyroid, our adrenal glands, our pancreas. And so these toxins that we're exposed to can affect the very way that our body produces and utilizes the hormones that we have in our body, and it starts to affect the way that our body functions. And so when we look at some of those, we'll talk about cortisol, we can talk about the thyroid, we can talk about the reproductive hormones, but I won't get into depth on that stuff. The other thing is, how do toxins affect us? Energy production. They will affect the very organelle in our cells that are called the powerhouse, the mitochondria. And that is a big, big deal, because if we can't produce ATP, if we can't manufacture ATP, the body's usable energy, your cells will expire. Because as humans, the first thing that we do is we breathe oxygen to live. The second thing that we do is we combust food into usable fuel. If these toxins are interfering, we cannot allow that process to happen, and thus our cells will expire. We look at our DNA. Our DNA is the very structure, the foundation, and the transcripts of our body. And so these toxins, when they get into the nucleus of the cell, can affect the very development of our DNA. And lastly, but not least, is they create what you call reactive oxygen species. Reactive oxygen species is the precursor to inflammation. So these oxidations, these oxygen species, think of an oxide. So an oxide has an unpaired electron. And if you have an unpaired electron, it is extremely ravaging to a cell. So we need to donate an electron to that to make it an O2. So reactive oxygen species are the precursor to our inflammatory processes in our body. So that's number one, how they affect us. And so if we look at the types of toxins and what we maybe call the chemical classifications, let's take a look at the first one. The first one are toxic elements. Just unlike the periodic chart. The worst toxic elements that we're exposed to from a metal standpoint: aluminum, mercury, lead, and cadmium. And now on that list is fluoride. So these are neurotoxins. These are identified neurotoxins. And so these are toxic elements to the body. The next one that we're looking at is VOCs, volatile organic compounds, which come in the form of gases and fumes. We're breathing those in every day, whether it's from our air conditioning or heating units, from the exhaust that we're breathing, from the chemical plants that are taking everything off. So you're looking at VOCs. The next one is natural. So natural, which is a hot topic right now, you're looking at molds, you're looking at bacteria, you're looking at funguses. These things are natural. They can get into the body and they can wreak havoc, especially on people that are susceptible to these. Plastics, BPA, bisphenol A comes from a plastic, and it is a major, major neuroendocrine disruptor, specifically the thyroid system, T4, even T3. So we're looking at plastics. And then you're looking at persistent organic compounds, or what you would call pollutants, DDT, glyphosate, these pesticides. We're exposed to these things, especially if you're living out in the country and you have farms around you and they're spraying all these things. We are always exposed to these environmental pollutants on a consistent basis. So as you can see, and then you're eating that from your foods. Okay, so as you can see, they're all around us and they're going to be affecting us, but they don't affect everybody equally. So then the question that comes to mind, are we detoxing specifically for a health condition or for removing one of these compounds on their own, or are we detoxifying globally? Where the question is, oh, I just want to detoxify because I want to lose weight or I want to feel better. And those are all plausible, but there's a way now that you have to look at this to make sure that you do the mechanism of detoxification correctly. Now, moving on to the dose response. Now, the dose response is an interesting one because we always think, well, if we're exposed to all of these materials, it must only affect us when we're getting clobbered by these materials. And the answer to that, based on research, is yes, but there's also another way that we get affected by these things when you call it the dose response. So we have a high dose response that overloads the immune system and we can't do anything about it, and the immune system gets taxed and the body gets overcome. The other one is low. If we have just enough exposure that doesn't turn the immune system on, or if we don't have the cameras from the immune system to pick these things up and they fly underneath the radar and they tiptoe over your tripwires and your little red beams that would set off the alarm, that persistence of those low dose toxins is going to be just as effective as that. So we can't escape that. And just because this isn't creating symptoms in your body doesn't mean that some sort of health effect is happening. So it is not dependent on a high dose response. There is a lot of information that talks about a low dose response that can affect us in just the same way. It just accumulates over time, okay? And symptomatically, from a toxic standpoint, there's one way to store toxins. It's in your fat cells. Your fat cells are protective to these toxins. They want to engulf them, and they're going to hold on to them. Okay, so we see that in weight gain. We see that in fat disposition, and not just like what you call cutaneous fat, but also visceral fat. So it's not hanging out just on the surface. It is really starting to affect us within our viscera. So that's really kind of a background right there. And what we want to talk about now is the downstream influences to this, which I already alluded to, and the phases. So downstream influences to highly toxic systems. First and foremost, we are not going to be able to produce energy. So if we can't produce energy, we can't power the cells to work right. So any sort of malfunction can happen within the cells. Plus there's just toxic buildup then that's in the cells. We have a party going on in here, and there's just everybody's invited, and we get more and more people. It just becomes so disruptive and disorganized, we can't do anything about it. So outside of energy, though, you start to decrease over time and accelerates the inability to lose fat. Okay, so fat loss is very impeded. I already talked about energy. How about building muscle? It can impede building muscle. We talked about energy, muscle, and then the big thing that I said at the beginning, the neuroendocrine, we can't produce hormones correctly, especially neurotransmitter hormones. So we can't create the proper messaging and the signaling in our body because of these interferences in the body. So these are downstream influences, and think about this stuff that happens very low dosage over a period of time. It takes years, which we call the therapeutic window here, but it takes years for these things to accumulate and start to create what you call a disease process. Because for years, maybe in your 20s, your 30s, even your teens, and sometimes, and most of the time in your 40s, you're not going to detect that your physiology is falling apart on basic labs. It just doesn't happen. When the physiology finally starts to fall apart is when you'll see this stuff grab on labs, and you'll start to see these blood elements and this chemistry show some different processes that are going bad. So that's the downstream influence, and then ultimately what this equates to is just loss of vitality, loss of health. So you're not trying, at this point, you're not trying to improve your health and upgrade your performance, but now you've got to rescue your health. You've got to jump into an arena that you've got to get this thing arrested and switched. You can't do them both at the same time. You have to do one or the other. If you're trying to survive, if your body's trying to hold on, you can't live. You can't build and grow. So you have to get these things taken care of first before you can build and you can grow, hence the influences that are happening there. So now what we know about detoxification and what we're going to uncover is going to be a little bit against the grain, and it might scratch you a little wrong because you're just going to look back at some of the things that you did. We're all guilty of it, and we're even guilty of it in the way that we're working with our patients in a way at looking at some of the new ways that we're going to move forward in doing our processes. So phases of detoxification. There's 4 phases of detoxification. We're going to talk about, first and foremost, we're going to talk about phase 0. So that's the first phase, and then we're going to go from 1 to 2 to 3. So phase 0. If we have toxins in the body, we have to get them exposed, and we have to get them into the cell. Because in the cell is the area where they can get recognized to start moving through phase 2 and phase 3. So phase 0 is getting these toxins out of their storage and getting them to be able to get into the cell where they can get recognized. So basically what we're doing is we're opening the door for these toxins to come into the room. And we'll talk about how we do that when we talk about detoxification. Okay? So this one right here is allowing the toxins to enter the room. I'm going to open the door, and I'm going to allow the toxin to come in. We'll talk about that strategy. Now, that toxin, any of these materials, is in the cell, we can tag it. We can identify it, and we can start to tell it how to get out of the cell, how to get out of the room. So basically, we're going to open the door. We're going to let that problem in. We're going to let that toxin in. When it's in the cell, phase 1 is about donating and polarizing this thing so it actually becomes hydrolyzed, or we're adding water to it. We're adding elements to make it water soluble. Because most of our toxins are fat soluble. Everybody knows oil and water, they don't mix. We can't get fat soluble toxins out of the body, which means that we're always excreting toxins. It's just how much do we want to accelerate the process. So in phase 1, we've got to give it a name tag. We've got to connect something to it that's going to make it water soluble or hydrolyzing it. In phase 2, then, since if we've given this toxin a room to go into, and we've given it a label, like a name tag, now we're going to conjugate it. Basically, we're going to tell it, we're going to give you something so you can leave the room. So we're going to give it a few bucks. We're going to give it some sort of incentive to leave the room. It's called conjugation. Okay, so hydrolyzation and conjugation. And there's materials that do that very well. Phase 3 is ultimately attachment. It's basically, let's open the door and let this thing leave and make sure that it gets out. So we've got open the door, connect it, incentivize it, and get it to leave. So attach and release. Not that easy. So what we do in all three of these phases is get it to become water soluble and then get it excreted from the body. Urine, stool, sweat, because these are our water exit systems. So how do we do that? We've got 3 phases. We first have to mobilize these toxins. Well, let's talk first. First and foremost, we have to talk about what we're going to do in order to detox correctly. So in a detoxification process, the first thing is we have to have our systems working correctly. So you can't get all jacked up and screwed up and be like, oh, I'm going to start doing the 4 phases of detoxification. It doesn't work that way. You have to ask these questions first. How are your elimination systems? How's your bowel movements? Are you constipated? Can you not go to the bathroom? Are there problems with your intestines? Because if you can't eliminate correctly, you're definitely not going to eliminate the toxins correctly. Okay? Second one, you might be drinking a ton of water, but are you actually hydrating? And so that's a whole different concept. I can drink a half a gallon of water a day, but am I actually getting that water into my cells? The exchange between your interstitial fluid and your cells, which is called osmosis. If you can't exchange the water, you can't do this. Okay? The third one here is you need the raw materials, which goes to our first component of our detoxification system. You got to get correct with a lot of things. And the first one is your lifestyle. And the first component of your lifestyle is what are you putting in your mouth on a daily basis? And if it's the toxic foods that we're going to discuss in 2 hours, then that's the first place that you've got to start before you can make any of these things optimized for yourself. Okay, so you have to look at your lifestyle. You have to look at what you might be exposed to, where you work, the foods that you eat, the environment that you live in. There are so many little things in lifestyle that we have to look at in order to understand what type of toxins are we dealing with and how much exposure to these toxins that you have. And if you want to get real specific, because you're dealing with real specific things, we have ways, we have testing systems to understand what you might be susceptible to, what you might not be able to be excreting on your own, what type of immune cameras you don't have that would allow these toxins to build up over time, and everybody's different. So number 1 is you got to get correct with your lifestyle. Number 2, like I already talked about, is excrete, get rid of the exogenous or outside exposures to the best component. All right. The next one is remediation of nutritional biochemistry. Every body system pathway uses micronutrients to work correctly. If we are nutrient deficient, we are not going to get this process to work as optimal as possible. So if we've got gut problems, if we're dealing with some sort of disease process, if we're dealing with conditions, if we're chronically ill, we have to replete the nutrition stores that are depleted, because it won't work if you don't do that. You can't just jump into these phases and allow that to work if you're nutrient deficient in some shape or form. So, and that will, what this will do is it'll optimize the pathways to detoxification, which are going to be these things right here. Okay, so that's A. We have to optimize it. There's a lot of things that we have to do in order to clean the situation up in order for this detoxification process to happen. So, first one is mobilize. We have to mobilize the toxins. So in a situation where we're going to detoxify, in order to mobilize the toxins, we have to get them out of storage. And so the first classic component of detoxification to enable this is called so reduction of caloric intake. And you will never ever hear us say that ever in another context in our systems except for this one. If you want this mobilization to happen after this stuff is correct, we have to reduce and restrict your caloric intake and use very specified foods in order for this to happen. So it's called mobilization. So there's three components of mobility. First, restrict your food intake. Because if you start to starve yourself just enough, this isn't talking about completely, but just enough, you're going to activate the system that's going to start releasing your fat cells because you're thinking you're needing energy. The other two components of that are influences of increased metabolic activity, exercise, and sauna. Specifically, we like using infrared sauna. So if you want to create a mobilization process, those are the best three things. Now, if we're still very toxic and we don't have a lifestyle that's going to support that, if you do this right here and you dump all that into a body that is not working efficiently at that point, I'm going to tell you you're going to get pretty sick. Okay? So this is first one is that we have, in a proper system, we have to mobilize. Okay? The second one then is that we have to use very specific materials, macronutrients and micronutrients, in order to hydrolyze and conjugate. We have to convert these toxins from fat solubility to water solubility. And here's the popular ones on the market. Milk thistle, curcumin, different green teas, glutathione. There's a boatload of them. But not every one of these is appropriate for the third part, which is being able to eliminate and get out of the body. Because some of those materials now are known to shut the door. So they do real good of hydrolyzing and conjugating, so giving them a name tag and getting them a send them to leave. But if they shut the door, you're not getting these things out. And so they recirculate and they build and they build and they build. So you might start to get some results out of the gate with these detoxification systems and these really popular known detox supplements. But over time, what's going to start to happen is that you're going to close the door and you're not going to be able to get them out of the body. So if we don't have this correct here, first and foremost, again, this isn't going to work correctly. And it's almost like everybody likes a bonfire when it's a little cold out. But if you make that bonfire too big, you got to start stepping back from it and stepping back from it because it gets too hot and then you don't want to be around it. It's the same type of thing. So it's a dose response as well. The same thing here, that highs and lows of toxins can affect this. And then when we get into here in using these micros and macros, too much of something can invoke that bigger fire, and then we still close the door there. So it has to be correct in phase 2 and phase 1 and phase 2. Use the right materials at a very low dosage to stimulate the effect, and now we've got to keep the door open. And that's where we're going to be using these specific macros and micros to be able to do that. And in phase 3, we've got to get it out of the body. So if we're dumping all of these toxins that are connected to water out of the body, we've got to use binders, fibers, charcoals, insoluble fibers, other materials that are connect to this and get them out of the body. Because if you don't, they will recirculate back up into the system. So we got phase 0 mobilization, macros and micros. And then number 3 here is elimination. And so when we start to do this process, then we've got to have things that are going to connect to these endotoxins and get them out. So process that goes through this, mobilization. We're going to restrict your calorie intake. We're going to do this over a 10-day period, typically once a month for 3 months. Once we start to reduce that caloric intake and we start and optimize mobilization, so sauna and exercise because of the induction of sweat, then we're going to start to use, at the right dosages, the macro and micronutrients in order to get the job done. We need to connect water to it. We may need to make it water soluble, and we need to give it an incentive to leave. Methylization, glutathionization, those type of things do extremely well right there. And then we needed to connect to materials to be able to excrete out of our urine and our stool. Because when we're sweating and we're using these saunas, we're getting it out of our sweat. Again, that's hydro, that's water, we're getting it out. So that's a proper detoxification process. And when you do this correctly, after a lot of other things are corrected, you're going to ignite fat loss because you're mobilizing this all out of the tissues. Okay? You're increasing energy because you don't have that influence on your mitochondria. You're going to be able to build muscle because you're getting tissue to build and connect, and your hormones are going to be working right. So you increase sleep, better sleep. You're reducing your mood swings. You're feeling better. So there's a lot of things that can happen from detox, but detox has to be done in a correct manner. I do feel and really believe that we are overdoing our detoxification strategies too much, and everybody has a process for it. But ultimately, when you look at the physiology of the body and what it's supposed to do, it just needs some help. It doesn't need a sledgehammer. So that's the detox system. Any questions?
Does the sauna, is a whirlpool equivalent to a sauna, or is that problematic?
Well, you have to look at the different ways that heat and water are going to leave the body. And so I do believe that the information says that saunas are the best because they invoke heat. So that's, it's radiation. It's radiating heat out of the body. So there's other ways. As athletic trainers, we get this exposure from acclimatization. So 2-a-days in football where they tell you how the heat leaves the body. When it gets too humid out, so when you start to get the amount of saturation in the water outside of the cells, there's not a exchange like that. Like osmosis, think of like water osmosis where it comes to the other side of the pipe and it excretes as water. So if it's water and water, it really doesn't truly do that. I guess in a long-winded statement, no. Yeah. So great. That's detoxification processes. If you have questions, we certainly have materials that back this up as well as different things. But again, this type of system is much more helpful in a customized way, just because we can start to look at your base metabolic rate. We can look at how you start to reduce calories correctly and what supplementation you need in order for these processes to ignite correctly. So we can talk on a one-on-one basis, and hopefully you found that information useful. And thank you.